drugs. Well, next, actor and San Francisco native Danny Glover, executive producer of the documentary The House I Live In, coming to PBS. It's a critical look at the so-called war on drugs. It won the grand jury prize at Sundance earlier this year. Glover is a longtime civil rights advocate. He spoke with KQED's Joshua Johnson about why he championed the project. First, a clip from The House I Live In.
It's absolutely true that drugs have destroyed lives, that heroin and cocaine, for example, do nothing to engender individual dignity. But while covering the drug war as a journalist for more than a decade, I came to understand that what drugs haven't destroyed, the war against them has.
Danny Glover, welcome.
Thank you.
What about the idea of doing a documentary specifically on the war on drugs appeal to you?
It's one of the issues that we never talk about, specifically about what is happening in our neighborhoods, cities, urban areas in this country. So we know that there's a direct correlation to the supposedly war on drugs and the increase in prison incarceration in this country, particularly among young black and young Hispanic kids. And that whole term of from the cradle to prison is a real term that happens in our communities for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of young kids. So the question of that war on drugs, and I think it's very important for us to understand what it means, what are the supposedly the intended consequences, and what were the unintended consequences of that war on drugs.
By a show of hands, how many people here had any kind of drug involvement and why they're in here?
I'm in there for selling drugs. I have a life and 30-year sentence.
I killed a guy back in 1984.
How'd that happen?
I just dope and out of my head, and I wound up shooting a guy in the mouth and killed him.
I saw a lot that I recognized of where I grew up. I'm from South Florida, and there were quite a few scenes in Miami and Broward County, so I saw a lot of streets and neighborhoods that rang very true to me. I wonder how much of it rang true to you in your experience. You grew up in public housing in San Francisco till you were about 10 years old.
I grew up until I was 11 years old.
Right.
I lived in Baby Hunters Point. I lived in the Betrayal District, and my parents bought a home in the Western Additions in the Haight-Ashbury when I was 11 years old. And yet we weren't immune to what was happening in that. I mean, I can name several of my friends that I grew up with, many friends that I grew up with who went through the prison industrial complex, got caught up in the war on drugs in a sense, whether using them or whether selling them. And from the time that I was maybe about 20 years old, I can record, or even a little bit younger, record men that I knew who died as a result of that.
Now, a lot of the documentary has to do with issues of race and class and subjects that a lot of people don't like to discuss in polite company, but that are integral to really understanding the war on drugs, the history behind it, the current predicaments a lot of people find themselves in. I mean, this is really rather thorny stuff.
The numbers, the demographics, the numbers don't lie. The fact that so many African Americans are incarcerated, it has to be something beyond just the fact we represent 12% of the population, and yet we represent nearly 50% of the prison population. It doesn't take a rocket science to say something is wrong, and we know that particularly in those communities, African American communities, communities that are in that where people migrated from often the South, came to urban cities, got jobs, good paying jobs, low skilled jobs, got those jobs, and those jobs were finally outsourced to somewhere where the labor was cheaper and everything. That's a reality that no one talks about. We don't even talk about deindustrialization as it affects not only African Americans, but working class and the union. The fact that at the end of World War II, we had a union population that represented more than 40% of the workers were in unions. Now we're down to something about 11%. We never discussed the situation. So if you're talking about race/class within that context, then you have a different other picture of what the situation is.
I think it's also something people don't like to discuss, because once you hear something like that, it's easy to look at it and go, wow, this is fascinating. I learned so much. What am I supposed to do about that? I mean, this is a gigantic problem that I think a lot of people, I came away from the documentary feeling like I really understood this problem in a new way, but even more confounded in terms of what to do about it.
Well, there are groups that are doing things about it. You know, I mean, programs like the Sentencing Project, or different lawyer groups who understand what the dilemma is. We understand what the dilemma is. You know, I mean, we could do something in terms of campaigning against this whole thing of 3 strikes you're out, which or the death penalty. All these manifestations.
Mandatory minimums.
Mandatory minimums. All those things, the kind of things that are happening, I think, around that are happening around the country. Beyond the documentary, the documentary only gives us a sense or context in which to look at the situation, and also introduces us to some of the work that some people are doing around the country.
And to those who will look at this and say, I can't believe that anyone would suggest that we would go soft on the war on drugs, or that we would retreat from the war on drugs and give up after 42 years, what would you say to them?
Well, the idea of the war on drugs is really not a war on drugs, it's a war on people. And essentially, the documentary allows you to identify real stories that happen. I mean, we've shown this documentary and real consequences that have happened as well. We've shown this documentary to high school students, the group in Washington, D.C., and when asked to raise their hand, how many of you know about the experience within your own family as someone you knew? Nearly the whole audience of black students raised their hand. So this is a reality that exists. These men and young men and women knew the story, but also knew that they were in harm's way and endangered by the same circumstances as well. But you can put this in Chicago and it resonates the same way. You can put it in certain places in New York and it resonates the same way. Those are communities that have been affected directly by this experience. Right. They know the story. And in fact, the beautiful thing about this is, as we've been able to do with a number of our documentaries, is find the constituent audience, find that audience which is able to directly identify with the story by their experience. So since in some sense, what the film does was validate an experience that often is left undealt with, that becomes out of the political discourse, the public discourse, and it goes untold.
I think there's some amazing storylines built into this documentary, The House I Live In. Danny Glover, I certainly hope it prompts as hot a conversation as we've had this afternoon. Thanks for talking to us.
All right, then. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
All right, then.
And The House I Live In airs nationally as part of the PBS series Independent Lens. It can be seen here on KQED 9, Monday, April 8th at 10 p.m.